and welcome to Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where we discuss the First World War and popular culture. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me are Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshall. Now, in a slight change to the schedule episode, we're going to be discussing our Dream Adaptations. Now, I think this was your idea originally, Jessica, and I wondered if everything actually worth adapting has been adapted. And are we talking about TV and film? Are we adapting something for TV and film, or readapting and reinvigorating something that's already been on the TV and film? Do you want to flesh out what you had in mind?
This came from a tweet, I think, and I can't remember quite now, but, various people talking about Dream Adaptations on Twitter, and I thought, oh, that would be fun to do. And I think it was actually around the sort of general cultural discussion around All Quiet. Did we need another adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front? So I think my thought behind it and how I've approached this assignment for today, because we all went off and did some work on this, was things that have not been adapted. It's not about readapting things that have already been, unless it is something that was originally created for film or television. But I was thinking more along the lines of war novels in particular that haven't been adapted. And I've definitely come up with one that hasn't been adapted. And I can sort of see why, as I will go into a bit later, I suspect. But I'm also, given the number of adaptations of All Quiet on the Western Front and now the number of adaptations of Journey's End, I'm also slightly baffled. So I think, we all took this and ran with this in our different ways. But I think it's open to that.
It's a good teaser that yours has never been adapted, because mine's never really been adapted for film, or certainly not TV in the last 50 years. Has yours been adapted, Chris?
So I wandered off in a slightly meandering route. The main thing that I've picked has not been adapted for TV or film. I have a couple of I think this would be fun that I'm not, one of which I'm not aware has been adapted, and the other one I think should be redone because I think it would be funny.
So who's going to start?
I think Jessica should start. She said the essay.
So I actually have two. I'll start with my first one, the one that I've done a bit of a deep dive into, which is Frederic Manning's The Middle Parts of Fortune. So there are two versions of this. There's the version that was first published as Her Private Swie, and then there's the unexpurgated version, which was published as The Middle Parts of Fortune. And I've gone with The Middle Parts of Fortune because I think, in today's culture, filmic world, we can probably deal with the language, although, oh my goodness, I'd forgotten it's been a while since I reread it for this program. I've forgotten just how fruity the language is, which, it's the way soldiers, it's the way young men talk. It was very shocking at the time in the 19, I guess the reedition was published in the 1930s, but it certainly is not particularly shocking in either literature or film today. So I don't think that would be the stumbling block to adapting it. I did slightly discover two stumbling blocks, I think, to adapting it. One is the unapologetic misogyny, particularly in the way in which men talk about their wives. There are women in the book, and some of whom have sort of character and agency, but a lot of the ways in which women are talked about is really unpleasant and uncomfortable, and that might have to come out in any adaptation. The other is its structure, which I should probably perhaps summarize what the book is, which is a little bit about where my surprise that it hasn't been adapted comes from, in that it is very similar to All Quiet on the Western Front. It is a picaresque that follows a small group of soldiers, principally Private Bourne, or I think he's actually Lance Corporal Bourne at one point, who is a middle-class alcoholic who's ended up in the ranks and is resisting promotion, even though he has various skills, both military and cultural skills, that make him promotable. And there's sort of pressures from various people for him either to go on a commissioning course or to be promoted to sergeant throughout the course of the novel. And he spends most of his time with two friends, Shem, and I'm now going to forget the younger man's name, which I think it's Martlow. That was it. I knew there was a T in there. And he's also good friends with a man called Sergeant Tozer. Now, what's really interesting about this book is it's the only war novel I know that is primarily told from the perspective of, or that not only is primarily told from the perspective of the ranks, but brings in the perspective of the sergeant and the sergeant major, because Sergeant Tozer is another character. We get quite a lot from Bourne's perspective. We also get quite a lot from Sergeant Tozer's perspective throughout the book, including the final scene, because Bourne ultimately dies. It's structured almost identically to All Quiet in that sense, covering the period of the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of the Ancre in 1917. But it ends, spoilers, with Bourne's death. So it is that arc that's using a character to reflect on war and men at war, and illustrating this through a picaresque adventure, through these set piece scenes. So it's very filmic in that sense. Actually, it's not so much filmic, but as the title indicates, it is Shakespearean. Manning was self-consciously Shakespearean in thinking about the book and its structure. When I was thinking about this as an adaptation, I thought, well, first of all, you have to do it as a play within a play. And I was thinking, you get a group of middle-class British school kids coming along to see a play, and you run it like that, which is fine, except the first 50 to 100 pages are predominantly set in flashback. So you get a dream sequence almost immediately, which is Bourne's dream of the experiences in the line on the Somme, which is incredibly vivid and just filmic in its own right. It demands to be filmed. And then a couple chapters later, you get a story told about Bourne, which is setting out his background, about an encounter he has with the regimental sergeant major at rifle training in England during the course of their training. So, I'm thinking, I don't know quite how you introduce dream sequences, flashback sequences into a play within a play structure, particularly not that early. So that would need some thinking. But fundamentally, because it is a picaresque, because it is these scenes, it is incredibly filmic in the way it's written. And it doesn't tell that much different of a story from All Quiet, except that what it does is really bring this perspective of the rancor and the non-commissioned officer even more into its storytelling. It's not what we get. We get either the German experience, which is fine. All Quiet is fantastic. Don't get me wrong. Not the most recent film, perhaps, but as a story of the war. Or we tend to get the middle class officers of Journey's End, except as stock characters. We don't see the sergeants and we don't see the non-commissioned officers. And this book is just crying out to be adapted to put that on our screen. As varying characters with varying motivations who, have immense power to shape the lives of the men under them, which is very much Bourne's perspective. The language indicates it's an unromantic view of soldiering, a deeply unromantic view of soldiering, which may mean that you need to leave the misogyny in there somehow. But anyway, so that's mine. I've sort of maundered on about it.
So what prevents it from falling into that horrendous trap that modern First World War films seem to do? It have ended up focusing on just endless grime of trench life and digging your way out of trenches. And
so it's anti that. Most of it is set behind the lines. So you have this opening dream sequence, and then they go into rest. And a lot of it's about the fear of going back into line. The second half, because it covers two major battles, they do go back into the line. But the majority of the book is actually set behind the lines. And you have Bourne being seconded to the orderly's room because he can type. And then they try and convince him to stay in the orderly's room. There is violence. So you have a scene where the rather depleted unit is trying to incorporate a new draft in and is training in a French town and behind the lines. And they've all been masked by the slightly inexperienced officer to do some training. And a shell falls right in the middle of this massed group of men and causes destruction. So there's that sort of bloodshed, which is about, the experience, long discussions about the experience of the officers, and was it Germans who had managed to get a long-range shell over, or was it the anti-shell batteries? Was it friendly fire, essentially? This is the tension and the struggle. So it's not set pieces set in the front line. It actually subverts our expectations in that way. And some of it's hilariously funny, some of it. The humor is incredibly mordant, but it is very, very funny without ever looking away from the grimness and the bloodshed. There's a scene where after the battle, after this dream sequence, after the battle, where Manning does it beautifully in about half a page of just describing what happens when at the call over, where they've lost a third of their men, and trying to establish, are they dead? Are they injured? Are they missing or prisoner of war? Trying to get some sort of eyewitness accounts of what happens to all these men in the chaos of battle, but also on the emotional reaction when you're asking men to report on their best mate who they've seen disintegrate before their eyes, but you have to get that information out of them, and that tension. So it creates drama without needing to be in the lines, in all sorts of great ways.
Where do you see this sitting on a ITV at 8:00 on a Sunday evening, or is this a BBC 4 kind of Saturday night 9:00, or
it's either like Parade's End, which was a big marquee event at the time, or All Quiet, an indie film, not necessarily a 1917 equivalent, but a reasonably well-resourced indie film.
You don't want to be going for the HBO extravaganza where it just gets stretched into about 15 series. And
No.
It's a one series idea stretched out over years.
It is one of these semi-autobiographical novels. Manning was also an alcoholic middle-class man, a journalist who ends up in serving in the ranks, which is why he writes from that perspective. And Bourne's perspective is very much of the outside observer, rather than both of the officer classes and of the officer classes, the non-commissioned officers and the privates. He's very much an observer. And Shem is also very much of an observer because of his Jewish background, and Martlow as well, because he's very young. So sort of three outsiders hanging out together. But you could potentially, if you wanted to do sort of multiple series of this, although what would you do? 4 years? How long can you drag the war out for? That would be a series that would really drive home just how dull a lot of war is. The hurry up and wait. There's a lot of waiting. I'm not sure you could do a series like that effectively. But the only other way to spin this out, if you did it for television for more than one series by not killing Bourne, would be to make him even more autobiographical of Manning and have him survive the war as a journalist who then goes on to write about it. And then you might do the structure, an almost Dickensian, David Copperfield-esque structure of the author writing their memoirs. But I prefer, for this one, I think the play within the play is much more true to what the book is trying to do. And that's the overall message of it. It's not war is grim and horrible, and it's not purely it's not a purely disillusionment message. It's war is human. War is a human action. There's one point where he actually says that in so many words. And all that this book is trying to do is to reflect the humanity of the war in both its horror and terror, but also its humor and companionship and friendship. That there's as much about the incredible relationships that men develop and the incredible enmities that men develop within military units in these highly emotionally heightened experiences, as there is about facing enemy fire and courage and cowardice and all the rest of it. It's a wonderful book. It is such an easy read. I sort of breezed through it in about 3 days. It is so funny, So even if it never gets made into a film, I do encourage people to read it. I'm really serious about how much I'd love to see this develop, to the point that I know we're in the middle of the Writers Guild of the Americas strike. If there is a screen dramatist out there who would like to collaborate with me on this, I am really open to offers. I need advice on process about how to gain the rights to the book and things like that. But I would absolutely love to develop a screenplay out of this. I think it's just crying out to be developed.
I'd say I know I have a copy of the book, but I can't see it on my shelf, which might end up meaning that I end up with a second copy of it. Then I probably can't find that. And
I think it went out of print in the middle of the 20th century and then came back in. The copy I've gotten out of the library, because my copy is buried somewhere in a box while we're putting new shelves in, has an introduction by Michael Howard from the 1970s, I guess.
I just need to be wary because, like Paul Fussell, I have 3 copies of.
That Paul Fussell stood behind you right now.
So I've found the bit where he talks about the war as being a human endeavor. This is actually Manning's prefatory note from 1929. War is waged by men, not by beasts or by gods. It is a peculiarly human activity. To call it a crime against mankind is to miss at least half its significance. It is also the punishment of a crime. That raises a moral question, the kind of problem with which the present age is disinclined to deal. Perhaps some future attempt to provide a solution for it may prove to be even more astonishing than the last. Anyway, that's my adaptation. And I'm deadly serious. If you are listening to this and you are a screenwriter or know a screenwriter who might like this challenge, please get in touch.
Jessica's bank details are number 21.
Shall I go next, Chris? Because mine won't pass the Bechdel test. Where I don't know if yours also. Yeah, my in some respects suffer from being too male oriented because there's not really any female characters in. I was going to suggest Biggles, and I was amazed that it hasn't really ever been adapted. There's an Australian radio series which was not from the books that came out in the 50s, and it got cancelled because listeners wrote in and complained that Biggles had gone soft because he'd got a girlfriend. So there's a certain expectation here that it has to be male orientated. The BBC, Granada do a 44 episode TV series in the 60s, but I can find absolutely it's not anywhere to watch. So I'm assuming we can write that off as not existing. There's the Biggles Adventures in Time, which is a 1986 film, but it's got nothing really to do with any of the original stories. This is Raiders of the Lost Ark meets Back to the Future, and Biggles skips from current day London back to France. And there's a interesting aside to that. There's a part where he's walking around a destroyed town in France, and if you've just finished watching Full Metal Jacket, you'll notice it's exactly the same building. It's because they shot it at that Docklands location where Kubrick films Full Metal Jacket, and it's absolutely clear that if you think of Full Metal Jacket, you go, yeah, those are the buildings. That's where the sniper is. It's all there. The BBC have done a radio adaptation, but it's Biggles Goes North. So the Biggles, you have the 6 Biggles books that are set in the war, then there's the interwar books, and they increasingly get sort of this more detective themed, which is what I believe the TV series is following Biggles as a sort of a detective.
I definitely listened to an adaptation of Biggles Defies the Swastika, so the Second World War ones for radio.
I can only find 2 audiobooks. I've been desperately trying to soak up as much Biggles. There's Biggles Flies East, which is a First World War adaptation. I think it's done in the 80s with Tim Pigott-Smith, set in, I think it's Egypt or Palestine. It's maybe set in Palestine. But my real justification for Biggles is they're just good ripping yarns, and the way I would do them is to do them in the style of Japanese anime, like Akira.
Ooh.
So they're dark, gritty. You've got the sort of a sense of realism, but at the same time, it's not aimed directly at that sort of Tintin market. So you can get in the themes that are there in the first books of death. You know, people die in those early Biggles books. His observer's killed behind him when he's flying. He's
horribly shell-shocked in the first one, isn't he?
Well, I was going to say there's elements of combat stress. He gets pale, he gets highly stressed and fidgeting, and it's noted about his lack of humour, his usual chippiness sort of goes away. And a repeating theme is this sort of ideas of anger and vengeance, and as a red mist falls upon him on the death of his friend. So I think there's plenty of grist for the mill, but I think you've just got to play it fairly true to the books. And I think the problem is, with the adaptations, certainly that I've managed to find, they tend to err towards Bertie Wooster. And I think you have to be careful to sort of stay out of the Bertie Wooster sort of portrayal of it. And it is easy to do because it is written sort of in, there's a lot of comparisons in the language that gets used. But you've kind of got to stick to the fact that it's this boys' own romp and sort of hang on that excitement that really comes through of the early 20th century modernity and the thrill of flying, and he describes it as awe-inspiring, his first dawn patrol. There's no fear. It's just, I'm flying. This is incredible. We're all together. And if you do it in that sort of anime cartoon style, it will allow for elements such as the mass aerial combat and the confusion to come through without having to either rely on a large number of biplanes that don't exist or a tremendous amount of CGI, which then gets kind of a bit computer gamey-ish as you're aping a realism. And I think if you go for the Japanese anime, you can take a step back from trying to be hyper-real and get across just those central narratives. And I think Biggles is actually, when I started thinking about it, and I'm happy to be contradicted, that he might be the poster boy for jingoistic Brexit Britain. But actually, I'd like to stand up for Biggles being he's a man of the world. He's brought up in India. His parents are working for the British government in India. He speaks fluent Hindi. He speaks fluent French. He speaks fluent German. He's kind of a citizen of the world, is Biggles, in many respects. He'll fly down and save German pilots and things when he's working undercover. So there's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said, I think, for Biggles' ideas of companionship coming through. He's fallible. But as I say, look at the First World War stories rather than those interwar stories, which become detective novels, really, detective romps. And I think there's a certain authenticity to them insofar as Johns, Captain W. Johns, who he wasn't a captain. No, this is not going good for trying to talk about authenticity, is it? The man himself was a territorial in the British Army pre-war. He serves at Gallipoli in Greece, and he's commissioned into the Royal Flying Corps. So there's a sort of authenticity to what he's drawing on. I love the fact that when he's flying in and around Hartlepool, he managed to shoot himself down twice due to a faulty synchronizer on his machine guns, blowing his propellers off, which I thought was a wonderful aside. Though when we get to the Biggles part of his First World War career, it's slightly more problematic because he was only in France for a month or so before he's shot down and taken a prisoner of war. But there is a certain daring-doness just looking at the shopping list of what he did in the war that I think adds something to Biggles. And as another aside, when I was looking up, and we've looked at T.E. Lawrence, as a recruiting officer, Johns turned down T.E. Lawrence for the RAF when Lawrence tried to join. He turned him down for using a false name. And he said, "You can't join, you're using a pseudonym."
I'm wondering if here what we need is less of an adaptation of Biggles and more a biopic of Johns.
Yeah, well, perhaps. As many of our conversations end up me starting with is a trawl on Amazon to see what's available, only to discover the Johns biographies are about £60, so I might have to keep looking for a cheaper version when one turns up. But yes, I would like to present that to you, and it's not a child's sort of cartoon adaptation of Biggles. It's something more sophisticated with the Japanese anime kind of undercurrent of glitty realism.
Something for Netflix to do.
It's an ideal one for Netflix for the simple reason that the animation will allow for it to be adapted into a myriad of languages. And I note that the Biggles Club is actually Dutch.
So assuming it takes off, what would your sorry, pun intended. But would you be open to the Second World War adaptations, where I think Biggles does become more jingoistic? And
I think there's 6 books there, and you can probably do a book a season. So you've got 6 years. I think after that you started to milk it. I think if you're wanting to do any more with Biggles, there's probably enough in the interwar years to do detectives stories like, some sort of Foyle's War, Bulldog. Well, maybe not Bulldog Drummond, but yeah, there's.
It is Bulldog Drummond-esque, but yes, I know what you mean. And there's a very good reason why I didn't choose Bulldog Drummond for my adaptation.
I think there are a number of very good reasons why you wouldn't choose Bulldog Drummond.
I have to say I'm not vastly familiar with Bulldog Drummond, and I am listening to the first Bulldog Drummond audiobook, and I'm completely lost. And I just haven't found it as gripping as the Biggles that I've been going through and rereading. The Biggles are sort of self-contained. There's a sort of excitement to them. I have to say that if anyone's never read any, look at the Michael Palin read version that the BBC did, which I think is all on. I bought it on Audible, but I think it's all on YouTube as well, so it's there for free. And it is a fantastic read. And Michael Palin does a superb job of not making it too, as I say, Bertie Wooster, which is where I think, if you're not careful, it ends up being all a bit Bertie Wooster.
See, one of the pleasing things I'm taking from this is that you've created a new metric for gritty realism, which I refer to as the animé Wooster scale. And everything now must be measured somewhere along that plane.
Well, I will admit to when I was first thinking of this, my initial humorous thought was to do Biggles through the medium of dance and have men on stages wearing aeroplanes.
Is this inspired by Peaky Blinders?
Yeah, it's sort of some Peaky Blinders, Monty Python-esque version of Biggles, which I think would work wonderfully, but you've kind of got to crank up the Bertie Woosterness of it. And I actually think Biggles works best if you take it out. And I think some of the past adaptations, they go for too much of that kind of Bertie Wooster, and it sort of detracts from it.
Well, I haven't watched it, but there's a Studio Ghibli film about the guy who designed the Japanese Zero.
It's brilliant. Yes, High Wind, something like that. It is wonderful. Yeah, but they use quite a lot of kites.
Maybe something like that.
Typing High Wind and Zero into Google has got me the Beaufort skill. Wind Rises, maybe?
Yeah, Wind Rises, that's it, yeah.
That's the one.
An anime film that can make the technology of aircraft design riveting entertainment is really quite impressive. Yeah.
Well, Ghibli's always had like a weird thing with planes in a lot of his films, as these kind of weird, how on earth is that staying up in the air type thing.
I like the idea of an anime Biggles. I think you could get round the Bechdel. I mean, it depends on how loyal an adaptation you do of the books themselves. But, there is capacity for writing in a nice auxiliary, as long as it's not a nurse. Please don't make it a nurse or her.
Well, I think the problem with that is it's very hard not to end up, as you say, falling into tropes, and then you kind of you might break the conceit.
But so if you were going with the Second World War, it would be very easy to have sort of a whack unit or to bring in the women's air transport or something.
But I think the problem with this is he's about 40 in the Second World War. And he's not even a group captain or anything. He's still only some minor.
I think he's well, certainly by Biggles defies the swastika. But in that case, he's doing a Harrison Ford, right? Going on. You'd have to cast Harrison Ford in a live action Biggles for the Second World War ones. But because of the nature of the RFC, especially all the training, again, it's one that there's quite a lot behind the lines. So there would seem to me capacity to create female characters around the auxiliary services rather than the nursing services, which would link in with this newly emerging branch of the military, which was very much what Johns was trying to popularize, wasn't it? And there's all sorts of really interesting stuff around women and mobility coming out of the First World War, mainly to do with ambulance drivers, female ambulance drivers, but also around sort of general driving and that sort of support, which I could see that actually you being able to write in a character that gives insight into the diversity of women's experience in the war.
I think it's just got to be subtly done, so it doesn't just look like someone who's been, which always gets criticised when people start adapting these early 20th century books. Oh, they've just stuck a woman in to be, a bit woke.
Yeah.
Wokeism gone mad.
Again. But I think there's more capacity in Biggles, perhaps. It could be done but it would take some skill. Yeah, I think you're right.
I mean, certainly interwar years would be easy to do. The First World War stuff, less. Although it does go.
Well, Biggles Learns to Fly is set in Canada, isn't it?
I can't remember. I have to say they.
I think that's part of the charm of Biggles, that you almost never need to.
Biggles.nl. That's the Biggles fan club in Dutch. I suspect you have a huge international sales. The International Biggles Association website's all in Dutch. Biggles is a bit odd because the books have all been released, re-released, unrelated. You see, so the numbering of the books gets a bit odd because they're sort of not. I mean, there's 100 or so books, isn't there? So the book ordering on the newer books is different to the older books, and then some are written out of order. So you're getting them. Some people number them chronologically.
There must be like compendiums that are, so heavy that ironically you wouldn't be able to get it on a plane.
I mean, because a lot of the story, and then a lot of the stories are published initially in boys' magazines.
In the Boy magazine, the Modern Boy. Biggles Learn to Fly, 12 stories from the Modern Boy, set out 24 chapters.
You do have a story called First Time Up.
We've had the Middle Parts of Fortune, and we never commented on the innuendo in the title, so I'm sure we can make.
Which it's not even innuendo. It's
innuendo.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you read it alongside the expurgated version. I always find very funny that they chose her private Swee for that one because he's being.
That'll clear it all up. Nobody will mind that.
It's Shakespeare. Manning is he's a Shakespearean scholar as well as everything else. I will just go on endlessly about how much I like this book. So we should get back to Biggles.
That's me. That's, I think he's worth a modern day revisit. I suspect it's the Bechdel test that puts people off in many respects. How about you, Chris? Does yours pass the Bechdel test?
Well, when I was thinking about this, and I came up with two, and I thought, those aren't what I want to do, but I think they're interesting, so I'll flag them up now. I'm not aware that Henri Barbuse's Le Feur has been adapted. It's not the easiest.
It'd be a challenge.
It would be a challenge, because, the plot meanders at times, and the pacing is a little interesting, and it's not an uplifting read.
That would be a BBC 4 foreign language production with subtitles, wouldn't it?
So I thought I'd flag that one up. Then I thought it would be quite funny to have a redone version of the Monocled Mutineer. Yeah, like Benedict Cumberbatch to play the lead role. Because one of the things I find interesting about the Monocled Mutineer is, when Gove started shooting laser beams out of his eyes a few years back, and by a few years back, I mean presumably within the last 20 years. Monocled Mutineer hasn't been on for decades. Like, no one has seen the Monocled Mutineer. It was only released on video or DVD in the early 2000s, I think. But doing an updated version of the Monocled Mutineer and seeing whether or not it makes everybody lose their minds. But also, I just think it would be fun and funny. Get Benedict Cumberbatch to play Percy Topless.
I did wonder if he was getting too old, because when I was trying to cast middle parts of Fortune, I was thinking, I've got to get Benedict Cumberbatch in here. And think he might have to play the regimental sergeant major. But yeah, I was having deep difficulties with his age. And Bourne is short, so I want Ben Whishaw for Bourne.
The other person I thought who could play Percy would be, ironically, Cillian Murphy as an attempted kind of, I can be aristocracy, but are you? Question mark. Would be a fun one.
Yeah, that would work. I could see that.
As Chris, the Monocled Mutineer hasn't really been on since it aired in the late 80s, and it's not available. You might want to fill in for people the synopsis of sort of what it is and what the kerfuffle's about.
So to give because this isn't even the thing that I want to adapt. This was just like an interest. I did one that I thought that would be an interesting, fun thing.
Well, keep it quick then.
Yeah. So it's basically Paul McGann. It is Paul McGann, isn't it? Plays Percy Topless, who is kind of a pseudo aristocratic figure who is an officer in the British Army, but also a thoroughly he's a bounder and a cad and a rogue, and organizes the mutiny, or kind of stokes the mutiny at Tarple in one episode. And basically a lot of people got very, very angry about it in the 1980s because it brought the reputation of the British Army and British soldiers and the First World War into disrepute in a way that just thoroughly wasn't on. And like members of Margaret Thatcher's government just lost their minds about it. But you've also got like an element of the backdrop of the Falklands War being in reasonably recent history.
Emma Hanna has a very good discussion of it in her book on the First World War on television.
Yes, she does. I find it interesting that it remains this kind of bête noire, this kind of figurehead for all that's wrong of the popular representation of the First World War, and no one's seen it because it's impossible to watch. In most, I think there are clips on YouTube at most. I don't think there are full episodes, or there certainly weren't a while back when I vaguely thought, it would be fun to watch it. To be honest, I wonder whether or not we should actually do an episode on the Monocled Mutineer and actually watch it and see what is actually in it, rather than, because I got shown the Tarple episode during my undergraduate degree. So I think that would be an interesting stir the pot adaptation. But the one I actually want to go for is I want to adapt a computer game for a episodic TV series. Again, I think Netflix, like 10 to 12 episodes, because I want the budget. The game was actually the focus of a What a Lovely Podcast episode. Angus, me and you interviewed Jon Fenice, who was the creative director of Valiant Hearts, which is a kind of a multinational experience of the Western Front between about 1914 to 1917. They've actually got a sequel coming out soon, which I'm going to assume no one's going to buy for me, so I'll have to spend my own money on. But Valiant Hearts charts the kind of the personal experiences of war of like 4 or 5 main characters. So you've got Emile, who is like French father. He's an older guy. He's got his kind of son-in-law is Karl, who is drafted into the German army. Emile is drafted into the French army, and Karl is married to Marie, who is Emile's daughter. You've also got Freddie, who's an African-American soldier whose wife is killed in a bombing air raid very early in the war, and he joins the French army to kind of have revenge on a slightly kind of Scooby-Doo-esque villain, German general called Baron von Dorf. And you have Anna, who, good news, Jessica, she's not a nurse.
Hurrah!
She's a vet.
Can I just interject here in that there are representations of vets in the First World War on screen, namely in All Creatures Great and Small. And Jess Carlson and I had a wonderful time watching that episode going, but what happens to time? They only had the armistice sort of 3 minutes ago and they're already killing all the horses.
It's like, well, this has been fun. I suppose we'll just have to go out and start doing the wet work.
Anyway, sorry, that's what vets in the war make me think of.
No, yeah, I like that a lot. So what you end up doing is these characters kind of wander in and around each other's lives on the Western Front, kind of interacting with each other and kind of getting into various points. The game is not framed as a war game, really, because you're not trying to kill anybody. You're trying to survive it. And the actual story is about kind of the narrative of each of these people as they kind of move around this kind of time and space. And I could see that working really well as like a 10, 12 episode season.
So is that, what was the big video game adaptation that just came out?
From AMC. The zombie, come on, Chris, the zombie thing.
Oh, The Last of Us.
Yeah, because that's again about travels through a landscape trying to survive.
Yeah. The issue that I have with films about the First World War is you don't have enough time. It's that thing you talked about earlier on, Jessica, hurry up and die, or hurry up and get nowhere, or whatever, and wait, sorry. You need the time to develop character, to show that actually, it's not 24/7 killing people. There are lulls. It's to be able to have any time with the characters, you need to have them outside of combat. So you actually get moments with the characters. And I think that would be a really interesting way of approaching this, you make it kind of character driven, you make it take its time, and you can kind of journey across these 2 or 3 years, because all of the characters are effectively trying to get to the same place. They're all trying to get back to Emil's farm. Emil wants to get back to his daughter. Carl wants to get back to his wife. Freddie and Emil become friends. Anna is kind of following along behind, kind of healing people. They've got the little dog called Walt, who kind of helps out at various points. And, that's the cute appeal right there. And, no one's trying to get to Armistice Day. They're just trying to get back to this farm. I mean, the narrative and the actual story of Valiant Hearts is gorgeous anyway, and I love it to bits. But it is also incredibly watchable. People did like huge long playthroughs of Valiant Hearts on YouTube and did good numbers with it, because it's a narrative game. You're not sitting there, wondering, which computerized pixelated person am I going to blow their brains out of next? Because it's not that sort of game. It's a narrative point and click adventure, really, where you kind of travel along with it.
So what language would you do it in? The
original game is French. So I could see it being an interestingly done in French with subtitles. I mean, All Quiet worked.
Yeah, that was why I asked.
Well, in some respects, I was going to say, if you flipped it around and made it German, I wonder if it had greater international appeal than if you did it in French.
But it'd be nice to have, there's so little representation of France, and, except as a landscape that others come into. Thinking of 1970, I like the idea of the farm as the goal. There's a lovely, and I'm not sure you could adapt it. I'd have to think. Spanish Farm Trilogy, and I totally blanked on the author, which is appalling because I wrote my dissertation on it. Anyway, but the point about that is because it's told from two different perspectives, from the perspective of the British officer translator, and from Marie's perspective, from the woman's perspective, which gets around the Bechdel problem actually in all sorts of really interesting ways. That could make a really interesting adaptation, but that would have to be a television program, because it is, and it would need multiple seasons, because it's 3 novels and they're incredibly dense. But because it's the Spanish farm is its own character, right? In that, so that idea of the importance of the land and the home to the French, I think, has not been properly represented on screen, and that would be amazing.
I then started thinking a little bit about casting, and then realised that it was irrelevant, because all of the German characters will be played by Daniel Brühl, as is contractually obligated. It would just be him in a variety of different mustaches. And then, once you've got to that point, then it starts to lose its meaning, really.
But presumably, if you do it in French, all the French would have a variety of different mustaches as well, as is contractually obligated.
Well, you're not doing it in the animated style of the original, then?
I mean, I like the animated style of the original, but my kind of feeling is, if you're not going to make an adaptation, make it different. And with your Biggles thing, of actually, doing it as animated adds something to it. But because it's already animated, I feel that the adaptation is to cast human actors as opposed to inhuman actors who...
Can I just interject here that it is R.H. Mottram who wrote the Spanish Farm Trilogy?
So yeah, that was my... I decided I avoided novels and the like. I went back to what I knew. So I watched some Star Wars. And then after doing that, I had to think, I don't know if either of you watched Andor recently, a Star Wars Disney Plus series, which was a real slow burner. It took its time. And that's what I think the benefit of this type of, the Netflix benefit is that you can have slow burning, they take their time TV series that will, hopefully maintain an audience. But equally, they'll then get cancelled, and then everybody's sad.
And so, would we ask would this be done in main language in French?
Well, I could imagine
there's some authenticity to it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, have the German characters speak German,
and Lupin did really well. You could get Omar Sy to play.
Yeah, that'd be good.
The African American.
But yeah, I mean, have the Germans speak German, have the French speak French, and subtitle it.
It's fine by me, but I do certain international audiences get hot and bothered about it, and then deem they have to remake it all in English.
Yeah, I didn't put on a TV series to read.
It never really troubles me, to be honest. I forget that I'm watching the subtitles.
The only issue I ever have sometimes with subtitles is sometimes I want to put a film on in the background and do something else whilst it's on. And you can't really do that with subtitles. It's like, no, I do actually have to watch this.
That's why I quite like subtitles. I find them more immersive. I can't look at my phone. I can't get distracted. So I think it's a great idea to keep it, I think with things like Netflix, it works much better and it's much more acceptable to get the natural people speaking their native languages because it helps with international sales. Whereas traditionally when a national broadcaster does them, there's a tendency to stick with the national broadcaster's language. Now, international sales are much bigger with things like Netflix distributing them. I think it's much more acceptable, and it's far more. I think it's just more exciting. I mean, I think the Scandinavians seem to have done it for a long time without even worrying too much about it. It's just possibly us English-speaking countries get a bit more problematic with it, being unable to speak a myriad of other languages.
Yeah, there's an underlying thing there. He says with his 1.5 languages at best.
So yes, there we go. 3 different adaptations. I think. Yours is the only film, Jessica. Chris and
I think so, yeah.
Intended for TV.
I can't quite see how mine would work for television, unless it's one of those big, as I say, BBC costume drama event television. But it's interesting that for all that it is a picaresque novel, it doesn't have sort of a tidy plot line. It's nonetheless one that is, as a novel, works coherently, not as a series. Whereas I think, Biggles, which is very much understood as a series, and I can see why a video game in the same way, because there's so many multiple options, work better as a series. Whereas I think for this is a very classic novel in its way, or indeed a play, but it works in that act structure that lends itself to a couple of hours rather than multiple hours of binge watching.
Very cool. Well, it'll be interesting to hear if anyone wants to let us know via Twitter what anybody else thinks of our proposals. Oh yeah, Chris, send a Twitter poll up. Put a Twitter poll up and see which of our adaptations people would prefer. That would be interesting to see.
Okay.
Vote.
And I'm just going to throw in, because I did say right at the beginning, I did have sort of a bit along the lines of Chris's 2 discarded options. I thought, it would be good, partly because I of how much I love The King of Hearts, that we need more First World War comedies, basically. And I had thought about an adaptation of England, Their England, which is, it's post-war, but it is a comedy, and it is about the legacy of war.
That's interesting. You're wanting more comedies, and I'm trying to steer Biggles away from being too sort of Flash Heart or Bertie Wooster.
There's a difference between being parody, and England, Their England is satire. There is that undertone of social criticism. Yeah, there's a difference between parody and satire that I think there's not nearly enough satirical comedy about the First World War outside of France, apparently.
Also, there are a lot of kind of points and spaces on the anime Wooster scale. Adaptations can fall anywhere along that high kind of wide measure.
Anime Wooster scale,
which is definitely going to be coming back in future episodes. By the way, I'll flag that up right away.
Yes, it is absolutely. Full credit, Chris. This is your creation.
Very good. So I think next time out, in one way or another, we're going to be discussing
Alice Wins In Memoriam.
In Memoriam. One way or another, we'll be discussing In Memoriam, which we have all read. Do we want to give any hint of whether we enjoyed it?
All I can say, I'm being very restrained because it's suddenly popping up all over my Instagram feed because I follow various book review. And I keep on wanting, I've been quite restrained about my comments on it on there.
I've skipped through it quite quickly. It was a pleasantly distracting read.
It is very readable.
Right, so I shall return to reading Biggles, and we'll see you all next month.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
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 Oh, oh.